Hi, my name is Liz Griffin, and I was a fall 2017 student teacher. This is my digital exhibition. I will basically be talking about an overview of my experience student teaching for the last 4 months, as well as what I taught and how, and showing a few of the final projects that students created, as well as the process behind those. The first lesson I'll be talking about is called Environment Colograph. I taught this at Westlake Middle School for the 7th grade under the cooperating teacher Marlene Seckendorf. The enduring understandings are artists portray their appreciation for the natural world by educating themselves and creatively displaying what they've learned. In an I can statement, this would be stated, I can create a colograph that portrays an environment that I've learned about. So I really wanted to integrate studying a subject before you depict it, like really knowing what you're depicting as an artist. Secondly, artists constantly make decisions about what they're creating based off of each alteration made in order for the piece to evolve. That's a complex way of saying I can allow my colograph to change by adding layers and building it up. So really it's based off of how a print turns out. Would a student want to keep it or not? Would they want to build off of what's there or change their thinking? So allowing it to evolve through the process. And thirdly, artists reflect during and on their completed work in order to learn from their personal art making process. The concepts were the natural environment, printmaking, colograph, technique, shape, texture, planning, and process. And we'll see how these concepts are integrated throughout. Okay, we begin with the PowerPoint talking about the environment. The environment, the definition is the surroundings in which a person, animal, or plant lives, the natural world as a whole or in a particular geographical area. So we talked about how art and nature correlate. How are they correlated and why would they be? Why would we want to do that? I asked students, I started with saying, whenever I look at the mountains or if I see a really beautiful scene, I always want to capture it. And as an artist, that's like a natural instinct of mine. But I asked them to raise their hands. I asked the students to raise their hands if they ever had that experience. And a few said yes, with the mountains or the ocean. So I built off of that saying, well, artists have been doing this for centuries. They've been educating themselves on the earth, basically, because art is a record and earth is our home. So these artists throughout time and still do record earth as our home in order to appreciate it and learn from it. And that is exactly what we'll be doing. So then we looked at a few examples of art that displays the environment. We started from a much older example going into, this is the oldest, but going into more contemporary ones in order to show that it's like a timeless art, really. So this is actually an alignment to standard too, because I spoke about different artists from different cultures that are still sharing the same idea but sort of in a different context. So that is in alignment to standard too. Then we moved on to an activity in which students created a Venn diagram and they compared these two works of art. What is similar? How are they different? We went over how a Venn diagram worked at first and then talked about, where does it goes in here, where they're similar. But I wanted them to look at what are the materials, what are the colors, what are the marks being made, the texture. So students did this first on their own, then they shared with a partner, and then we talked about it as a class. And they loved this. They had so much fun. They had so many things to say. And this is in alignment to Standard 3 because of its, in my eyes, effective instruction, because it gave them a chance to really look and observe what a colograph is before I just showed them. So they did that, and then I said, well, the one on the left is a colograph, and that's what we'll be making. And I went sort of into the process Not as much now because we did a lot much more later, but it's a form of printmaking. It's, roll the ink over the top, it sticks. And then I showed them several examples of environments that they could choose from so they could sort of visually understand what they might be interested in. And once students chose their environment, we had a day of research where they chose or they learned and wrote down 3 facts about that environment. And then they answered, what is one threat that exists towards your environment, or how does your environment benefit life around it? For this exercise, I gave students the only option of using National Geographic because National Geographic had every environment on it and very valuable information, and I didn't want to go through the trouble of teaching how to be, a digital citizen, and it just gets messy. So we all did National Geographic, and after that, they chose 2 images and sketched both quickly. I briefly touched on composition, briefly, how you can have a photo be from a cool angle, or how is your eye moving through the photo. Just get them to think about it a bit. Once they sketched both, they chose one, but first we went over the collagraph process much more in detail. So I had each step, I left some out, but I took a photo of me doing each step, and the students followed along on this page. They wrote them down, each step, and I also highlighted the vocab words like additions and brayer. So we went through this as a class, students followed along, it was engaging. But I also provided a demo afterwards in order for students to get different avenues for learning this information. So we did this and they wrote down the steps, but they also watched a demo, and I asked questions about what might come next, what might happen while I was demoing. Here's the criteria. Students knew that from the beginning. We talked about what is a texture. Most of them knew, so that wasn't much of an issue. But they had to have 10 shapes minimum for their plates. Here's an example of a few plates that students made. We spent a whole day creating these, and they were difficult for some students to understand, grasping how their drawing of their environment would translate into these, sort of abstract shapes on a plate, and also about, if this is yellow, is it going to be yellow on my print? No. And so this was also almost like a risk and a leap of faith for them to just sort of go along with it and see what would happen. So I think there's a lot of thinking involved with this. It was cool to watch them figure it out. Then we began printing. So they knew they needed to have 3 editions. Within those 3 editions, 1 black print and 1 white print. Here's how it was set up at each table. Students progressively were able to use more color. Here's an example of some of the black and white ones. Here's an example of of the print and the printing plate. You can see how they're opposites, so that was something students had to grapple with. Another example of the plate with the print. Some more black and white, several colors. So really a lot of this process was taking risks and learning from them, and seeing how they turn out. And we really pushed on students that they're not going to turn out how you expect, but you're going to have to go with the flow, and that's like an advantage to printmaking. We did a lot of midway reflections. What have you been learning? What have you been discovering? And then here's the final assessment rubric based off of researching their facts, integrating 10 shapes, 3 textures, layers, and the studio habits as well. Here's the reflection. Okay, second lesson, creating a door to a new world. Mountain View Elementary, 2nd grade. Jennifer Lau is my cooperating teacher. The enduring understandings are here. I can brainstorm and plan for what I want my world to look like. I can draw details that exist in my world by using shape templates and reference images. I can take my time when I draw. The concepts are imagination, shape, composition, location, space, and detail. We began by students closing their eyes, and I said, imagine that you're opening your door and you open up to a whole new world. And once they opened their eyes, I asked them about what they had seen, and I asked about the details and what colors those were. I really got them to think about it, visually what they were imagining. We went over the learning. Oh, this is Frank Att. He's a digital artist who created these worlds, these imaginary worlds, and I showed them to students to get thinking and realize that there's still contemporary artists making this kind of stuff. Like, it's relevant. Here are the learning targets. That's a standard 3 alignment because I was setting students up for success. Oh, and communicating effectively. So after that, we listed ideas on the board of all the different worlds we could come up with. Based off of those ideas, we voted on the top 3, and those top 3 were to be the worlds that students could choose from. They created these the plans, where your world was, the setting and context, and then what existed in your world, and that was what they listed here and drew. So that was a lot of planning. Then we began to draw with pencil. I began with, what is a horizon line? What is it used for? What's the point? We talked about how it's where ground meets, and then we talked about details and images and how they can fill up the page, and going slowly was very important. I modeled on the board simultaneously each of the 3 worlds that they could choose from, and I showed them how slowly I was going. But I really emphasized my world should not look like your world. You are your own artist, and yours should look exactly like your own. But I'm just suggesting maybe if you have underwater, you might add seaweed that looks like this because there's water and water's always moving. But also there were shape templates at each table and reference images for students to utilize in order to guide their drawing. So you can see with this, with this shark, you can see that a student used a shape as well as these. And especially with this one on the left, you can see how the student utilized a lot of the shapes in order to draw. Differentiation was sort of naturally embedded into this lesson because there was so much choice with how many shapes you wanted to use, what images you wanted to use, and students were able to really, like, for example, add a bunch if they felt more inclined and like at a higher level skill, or less. It was totally up to them how detailed it was going to be and what shapes they wanted to use. So in this way, that was differentiated and scaffolded. Here are a few examples. Students went over their pencil lines with Sharpie in order for it to be easier to paint. Here's a few examples of the final products. They all had different worlds. But we also talked about how watercolor, what are a few components of watercolor? It'll bleed if you put too much water. If you paint right by another color, it will bleed. But also make sure to keep your brush wet. We don't want to make it look scratchy. Here's a few more. Here's an example of a standard 1 alignment because I really pushed students and showed them how important it was to see a project all the way through. This took a lot of steps, but they were engaged the whole time, really because it was personal to them. Here's the rubric based off of brainstorming, looking at their art, if they utilized the reference images, if they took their time, if they participated and brainstormed. So that's it. Thank you to Sam and Patrick and Jennifer Law and Marlene Seckendorf and for everyone else along this experience. I learned so much. Thank you. That's the end.